friends, today I will tell you the story Old Mr. Sally. This story is about a person named Mr. Sally who is in a very poor condition, but he is helped by Robert Brown. Robert Brown is a small schoolboy and he does not get any job even though he is in a very bad condition economically. He tries to get many jobs but he does not get any of them. One day he finds Mr. Sally, and that time he decides to help him without any expectations, and only everything out of kindness. So let's begin. Old Mr. Sally. Robert Brown sat on his front doorstep and wondered how to get a job. It would have to be on Saturdays because he went to school the other days, or it would have to be before or after school. Dad can't get any work, and Mother's very ill, and we are such a large family, said Robert to himself, thinking of his 5 brothers and sisters. If I could just get even £1 a day. If I could just get even £1 a day, it would help. He set off to look for a little job of work to do. But he was very small for his age, and nobody would try him. No, said the man at the newspaper shop. I don't want a baby like you. You'd never be able to deliver my newspapers for me. You'd fall off the bike. No, said the chemist. You won't do for me. I want a much older boy. No, said old Mrs. Smith, when he went to ask if he could weed her garden each week. I want a gardener to do that, not a little rascal like you. So it didn't seem a bit of good trying to get any work to do. Robert sat down on his front doorstep again and felt very unhappy. Then he heard the clump clump of heavy feet, and he looked up to see who was coming. It was old Mrs. Sally, who lived at the corner house all alone. People said he had a lot of money, but he didn't look like it, for his clothes were dusty and dirty, his boots were never cleaned, and his hat had a hole in it. He wore thick glasses and was so bad-tempered that boys and girls ran away from him when they saw him. Just as he was coming up to Robert, he gave a groan and stopped. He leaned against the wall, and Robert saw that he was very pale. He's ill, thought the little boy, and jumped up, for he was a kind little fellow. Is anything the matter? He asked Mrs. Sally. Can I help you? My eyes have gone wrong, said Mrs. Sally. I can't see. I feel ill. Will you guide me home? So Robert took his arm and guided him down the street to the little house where Mrs. Sally lived. He took him right up to the door and then unlocked it with the key Mrs. Sally gave him, for the old man could not see the lock. He went indoors with him and looked round. My, what an untidy house! Newspapers thrown everywhere, dirty dishes on the floor, table, and in the sink, and everything covered with dust. Robert thought of his own nice clean home and turned up his nose. Fancy living in a place like this. Thanks, my boy, said old Mrs. Sally, and sat down on a dusty chair. That's the first time anyone has ever shown a kindness to me. Now you run off, or your mother will be wondering where you are. Robert said goodbye and ran off. He kept thinking of the old fellow all that day, and wondering how he was getting on all alone in his untidy house. I suppose his eyes are so bad that he can't see how dirty and dusty it is, thought Robert. It must be horrid to be old and live all alone. He must be very lonely. The next morning, before school, the little boy slipped up to Mrs. Sally's house. He knocked on the door, and a voice said, Come in, the door isn't locked. He went in. Mrs. Sally was sitting in a chair, looking ill. There was no fire. Robert thought it all looked very horrid and uncomfortable. How are you today, sir? He asked. Bad, my boy, bad, said Mrs. Sally with a groan. So cold, too. I'll light your fire, sir, said Robert eagerly. You'll be warmer then. He lit the gas fire for the old man. Then he cleared up the newspapers and put the room tidy. Would you like me to get anything to eat, sir? I can cook bacon and eggs. I do at home sometimes when there's a need to cook. Thanks, said Mrs. Sally. So Robert hunted about and found some bacon and an egg to fry and a frying pan. Then a fine smell rose in the air as the bacon cooked in the pan. Robert soon took a tray to the old man and asked him if he should put on a kettle and make him some tea or coffee. Then I'm afraid I must go, or I'll be late for school, he said. But I'll come in tonight if you like, and see if there's anything I can do. Shall I tell my mother to ask someone to come in and clean up a bit for you? No, thanks, said Mrs. Sally with a frown. I don't want any woman messing around with my things. You come in tonight, Robert. I didn't mind you. The boy ran off and was just in time for school. He thought about Mr. Sally as he worked and wondered what the old man was doing all alone with no one to speak to him or look after him. Well, as I can't seem to get a job of work, I might as well do something for nothing and see what I can do for Mrs. Sally, he thought. So that night he went round to the old man again and found Mrs. Sally eagerly waiting for him. I've got sausages and tomatoes, said Mrs. Sally. Can you cook them? If you can, take 4 sausages yourself and 3 tomatoes. We'll have a fine supper together. Well, Robert was very hungry, and soon the two were eating a most delicious meal. Then Robert made the old man's bed. After that, he went to the sink and washed up every dirty dish and cup he could see. He swept up the room, tidied it, and put a kettle on so that Mrs. Sally could make himself a hot drink later on. He gave the newspaper to the old man, but Mrs. Sally didn't seem to want to read it. Instead, he asked Robert to talk to him and tell him about himself. So Robert told him about his father, who couldn't get any work, and his mother, who was ill, and his 5 brothers and sisters. He told him how hard he had tried to get a job of work to do so that he might earn some money to buy something for his mother. And I couldn't get any work at all, said Robert with a sigh. Well, you're doing plenty for me, said the old man. I wonder why you are doing all this, Robert. Oh, said Robert. You were looking very ill, and I was sorry for you, especially when I saw the muddle your house was in. You just did it out of kindness, then? Said Mrs. Sally. Did you hope I would pay you? Oh no, said Robert at once. Of course not. Besides, I'm sure you haven't got much money to spare because you go about in such dusty old clothes and have a hole in your hat. Good gracious me! Am I as bad as that? Said Mrs. Sally. And I must really look into this. Will you come shopping with me when I'm better and help me to choose some new clothes and a hat? Well, Robert promised that he would. And in 2 days' time, the old man was about again. He and Robert went into the next town on the bus, and my goodness, what fine clothes Mr. Sally bought for himself. A very beautiful hat, too, brown with dark brown ribbon around it. And now what about you? He suddenly said to Robert. You look a bit as if you could do with some new clothes too. Come along. And will you believe it? He bought Robert a new suit, a new cap, a new tie, and even new boots. Then he took him into a shop and bought him the biggest strawberry ice they had. Robert could hardly believe his eyes. And now we'll buy a present for your mother and each of your brothers and sisters, said Mrs. Sally. So off they went, bought a red jumper for Robert's mother, big dolls for his sister, railway trains for his brothers. And the old man bought a great bag of currant buns, and off they went home. What a surprise for Robert's family! His mother stared in astonishment, and all his brothers and sisters shouted for joy to see their presents. I don't understand, said Robert's mother. Why do you do all this for us? Well, said Mrs. Sally, this small boy of yours came and looked after me, tidied my house, cooked meals for me, washed up, swept the floor, made my bed, all out of kindness, not expecting a single penny and never asking for one though he badly needed money. He didn't know I was rich, but I am. Although I live in such a little house and I don't have anyone to see to me, so I planned a little surprise to pay back Robert's kindness. And I found work for his father, so please tell him to go to his new job tomorrow. Well, would you believe it? Everyone stared in delight to think that old Mr. Surly, whom nobody liked, should do all this. And will you let Robert come in and do a few things for me still? Asked the old man. I will pay him this time, £5 a week. Robert nearly fell off his chair in surprise and delight. But I don't want to be paid. I'll come I'll come because I like you. That's the nicest thing that has ever been said to me, said Mrs. Sally, and he went red with pleasure. No, Robert, you have done a lot for nothing. Now you shall get a job of work with me, and be paid. You're worth every penny. So now Robert has his job of work, and he very much enjoys it too, especially when he shares sausages and tomatoes with Mrs. Sally. His father has a job as well, and everyone is happy. You're a good boy, Robert, his mother sometimes says to him. If you hadn't been kind to an old man that day, we wouldn't have had all this luck. As for old Mrs. Sally, well, you wouldn't know him now. He's so smart and neat, and you should see his face. He's all smiles and beams, with never a frown to be seen. The moral of the story is that kindness is always rewarded with a more bigger kindness. So we should always be kind. We should never be very attached to money. We should always be less attached to money. Thank you.